The morning that changed everything. Karen Washington woke up to the soft hum of birds outside her window. The morning sun filtered through the white lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the walls of her modest apartment. It was a new day, and she had every intention of making it count. Karen, a 32-year-old black woman with an air of quiet resilience, had weathered more than her share of storms. Her past was a tapestry of challenges, but she refused to let those threads define her. With her prosthetic leg, a sleek, high-tech marvel she affectionately nicknamed Grace, Karen had learned to walk tall, figuratively and literally. This morning was no different. As she prepared for her daily walk, she glanced over at Max, her beloved white rabbit. Max was perched in his little bed near the window, nibbling on a piece of lettuce. His twitching nose and large, expressive eyes were a source of constant joy for Karen. He had been her companion through sleepless nights and moments of doubt, a small but powerful reminder of life's gentle comforts. "You ready for our adventure, Max?" she asked, her voice light, as she scooped him up. The rabbit nestled into her arms, his soft fur brushing against her cheek. Karen slipped into her favorite pair of leggings and a simple sweatshirt, adjusting her prosthetic leg before heading out. The limb had been a part of her life for years, a necessity after a car accident that changed everything. But Karen had never let it slow her down. In fact, it was a symbol of her determination, a reminder of how far she had come. The streets were alive with the rhythm of the city as she stepped out. People bustled past, cars honked in the distance, and vendors called out their wares. Karen loved these walks, a chance to clear her mind and embrace the world around her. Max, tucked securely in his carrier, peeked out with curious eyes. As she approached the park, a sense of peace washed over her. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the laughter of children echoed in the distance. Karen found her usual bench and sat down, letting Max out to explore on the soft grass nearby. She smiled, watching as he hopped playfully, his white fur glowing in the sunlight. For a moment, everything felt right. The world, with all its chaos and challenges, seemed far away. But the tranquility didn't last. A patrol car pulled up to the curb, its engine growling as it came to a stop. Karen noticed it out of the corner of her eye, but paid it little mind. Police vehicles were a common sight in this part of town. She turned her attention back to Max, who was now sniffing at a cluster of daisies. "Excuse me," a sharp voice called out. Karen froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned her head slowly, her eyes landing on the officer stepping out of the vehicle. He was tall, with a sullen face and a posture that radiated authority, an authority that felt more oppressive than protective. "Yes," Karen replied, her voice steady but cautious. The officer's gaze swept over her, lingering for a moment too long on her prosthetic leg. His lips curled into a smirk as he sauntered closer. Karen's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What's the deal with the rabbit?" he asked, nodding toward Max, who had stopped hopping and was now staring at the stranger with wide eyes. "He's my pet," Karen said simply, standing up. "We come here every morning." The officer chuckled, a low, mocking sound that sent a chill down her spine. "A rabbit? Really? What are you, some kind of Disney princess?" Karen clenched her jaw, refusing to take the bait. She bent down to scoop Max into her arms, cradling him protectively against her chest. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone measured. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a hard stare. "Problem? Yeah, I'd say there's a problem. People like you loitering around, acting like you own the place." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She had heard those words before, words laced with veiled threats and unspoken prejudice. But she refused to let fear take hold. She straightened her back, her voice firm. "I have every right to be here, just like anyone else." The officer took a step closer, his presence looming. "Is that so? And what about that fancy leg of yours? Bet the taxpayers paid for that, huh?" Karen felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had worked tirelessly to rebuild her life after the accident, and her prosthetic was a result of her hard-earned insurance. But she knew better than to argue. This wasn't about logic or fairness. It was about power. "Look," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I'm just here to enjoy the park with my pet. I'm not causing any trouble." The officer snorted. "Trouble seems to follow people like you." Before Karen could respond, he reached out and grabbed her arm. The suddenness of the action made her gasp, and Max let out a frightened squeak. Karen tried to pull away, but the officer tightened his grip. "Let go of me," she said, her voice rising. "Not until I've had a look at that leg of yours," he sneered. With a swift motion, he yanked her prosthetic free, causing her to stumble. The crowd that had begun to gather watched in stunned silence, their faces a mix of shock and fear. Karen fell to the ground, clutching Max as tears of humiliation and anger blurred her vision. The officer held her prosthetic aloft, as if it were some kind of trophy. "Look at this," he said, addressing the onlookers. "This is what you're paying for." Karen's sobs turned to fury. She looked up at the man who had stripped her of her dignity and made a silent vow. This wasn't over. This day would not define her. It would be the start of something much bigger. The spark of defiance. Karen sat on the cold ground of the park, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled as she clutched Max close to her, the rabbit's small, frightened breaths matching her own. Around her, the crowd stood frozen, their silence deafening. The officer smirked, holding her prosthetic leg aloft like a twisted trophy. Inside Karen, a storm was brewing. The humiliation, the anger, the injustice, it all coiled tightly in her chest, like a spring ready to snap. This wasn't the first time she had been belittled, but it was the first time it had been so public, so visceral. She felt stripped bare, her strength questioned, her dignity stolen. But something else stirred within her, defiance. The officer, oblivious to the crowd's growing unease, threw her prosthetic to the ground with a contemptuous sneer. It landed with a dull thud, the sound echoing louder in Karen's mind than the murmurs of the bystanders. "Get up," he barked, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Or can't you without your fancy leg?" Karen's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. She thought of Max, trembling in her arms, and knew she had to stay calm. Not for the officer, not for the crowd, but for herself and for the small life she held close. With a deep breath, Karen adjusted her position, using her arms to stabilize herself as she reached for her prosthetic. Her movements were deliberate, measured. She refused to let him see her break. Slowly, she fixed the limb back in place, the process one she had perfected over years of practice. Once it was secure, she stood, her eyes locking onto the officers with a fire that startled even her. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady despite the quiver in her knees. "And you'll regret this." The officer laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Regret? Lady, you've got no idea how the world works. You're nothing but a footnote, a statistic." Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to the crowd. "You all saw what he did," she said, her voice rising. "This is the face of abuse. This is what happens when no one speaks up." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others murmuring to each other. A young woman in a hoodie pulled out her phone, the screen glowing as she began recording. Another person followed suit. Karen noticed, but didn't let herself hope too much. She knew how easily people could retreat into inaction. The officer noticed too, his smirk faltering as he scanned the growing number of phones aimed in his direction. "Put those away," he snapped. "You're interfering with a police investigation." "Investigation?" Karen shot back, her anger cutting through her fear. "What are you investigating?" "A woman walking her rabbit." His face darkened, and for a moment, Karen thought he might lash out again. Instead, he turned abruptly, stalking back to his patrol car. "You people think you're untouchable," he muttered, slamming the door. The engine roared to life, and he sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust and tension in his wake. Karen stood in the aftermath, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. The crowd began to dissipate, some offering her small nods of solidarity, others walking away as if nothing had happened. A middle-aged man in a suit approached her cautiously. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, his tone hesitant. Karen nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I'll be fine," she said, cradling Max closer. "Thank you." The man hesitated, then handed her a business card. "I'm a lawyer," he said. "If you need representation or advice, call me." Karen took the card, her fingers brushing the embossed print. She didn't look at it yet, but the gesture meant more than she could say. As the park emptied, Karen walked home in a daze, her thoughts a tangled mess of anger, shame, and determination. She knew she couldn't let this go. If she stayed silent, the officer would do it again, to her, to someone else. And she couldn't live with that. When she arrived home, she set Max gently in his bed, stroking his fur until his trembling subsided. Then she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the lawyer's card. She didn't need to think long. Picking up her phone, she dialed the number printed in neat black font. "Hello, this is Alan Jones," a calm voice answered. "Mr. Jones," Karen began, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "This is Karen Washington. I need your help." Over the next several days, Karen and Alan worked together to document everything that had happened. Karen shared the video she had taken on her phone before the officer ripped her prosthetic off, as well as the recordings from bystanders. Alan assured her that they had a strong case, but Karen wasn't just interested in legal action. She wanted accountability. She wanted change. The videos began circulating online, gaining traction on social media. Karen's story resonated with people. Her courage, her refusal to back down, her vulnerability. Comments flooded in from strangers, some offering support, others sharing their own experiences with abuse of power. Karen was overwhelmed but determined. With Alan's guidance, she filed a formal complaint against the officer and demanded an internal investigation. The local news picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere. Karen's face appeared on television screens and headlines, her name becoming synonymous with resilience. But the backlash wasn't far behind. Karen received messages from people accusing her of exaggerating, of seeking attention. Some even defended the officer, claiming he was just doing his job. Karen tried to ignore the negativity, focusing instead on the outpouring of support from those who believed in her. One evening, as she sat in her living room scrolling through the countless messages, her phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Karen Washington," a deep, authoritative voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Karen replied, her heart pounding. "This is Jake Washington, Deputy Secretary of Defense," the voice said. "I'm your brother." Karen froze, her mind racing. She hadn't spoken to Jake in years, their relationship fractured by time and distance. But now, his voice carried something she hadn't expected, a fierce determination. "I saw the video," Jake continued. "What that man did to you, it's unacceptable. I'm coming to help." Karen's throat tightened. "Jake, I don't need. You need someone who can fight this system from the inside," he interrupted. "And that's what I'm going to do." For the first time since the incident, Karen felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what Jake's involvement would mean, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone in this fight. Rising from the ashes, Karen paced her living room, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The unexpected call from Jake had left her conflicted. She hadn't spoken to her brother in over a decade, their relationship strained by unresolved family tensions and his demanding career. Yet, here he was, stepping into her life when she felt most vulnerable. True to his word, Jake arrived the next day. He was as imposing as Karen remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding a natural authority that made people listen. His suit was impeccable, his expression serious, but when he saw her, his features softened. "Karen," he said simply, opening his arms. Karen hesitated for a moment before stepping into the embrace. The tension of the past years hung between them, but the warmth of his hug felt genuine. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," Jake said, pulling back to look at her. "But I'm here now. We're going to fix this." Karen nodded, unsure of what to say. She led him to the couch, where they sat and began to talk. For the first time in years, they shared pieces of their lives. Her struggles after the accident, his rise through the ranks of the Department of Defense. It was a tentative bridge between them, but it was enough. Jake wasted no time. Over the next few days, he made calls, leveraging his position and connections to bring Karen's case to the forefront. His name carried weight, and people listened. Karen watched in awe as her brother navigated the labyrinth of bureaucracy with ease, turning a personal tragedy into a public cause. Meanwhile, the video of the incident continued to gain traction. News outlets aired the footage, accompanied by interviews with Karen. Her voice, calm yet firm, resonated with viewers. "This isn't just about me," she said during one interview. "It's about the countless others who face this kind of abuse every day, but are too afraid to speak up. We can't let fear silence us." The public response was overwhelming. Social media erupted with hashtags like #JusticeForKaren and #EndAbuseOfPower. Activists rallied in front of the police station, demanding accountability. Karen's story had become a movement, a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice. But with the support came opposition. Karen received threatening messages, some anonymous, others from emboldened detractors who accused her of smearing the police. She tried to brush it off, but the weight of the backlash took its toll. One night, as she sat on her bed scrolling through hateful comments, Jake walked in. "Stop reading that garbage," he said firmly, taking her phone. "They're just trying to intimidate you." Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's hard not to let it get to me." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than this. They're afraid because you're making noise, and noise leads to change. Don't let them win." His words bolstered her resolve. Karen decided to focus on the positive, the messages from strangers sharing their own stories, the growing community of supporters, and the hope that her fight could make a difference. The internal investigation into the officer, identified as Sergeant Brad Tanner, began in earnest. Jake's influence ensured it wasn't just a formality. Karen's lawyer, Alan Jones, provided evidence from multiple witnesses and the videos taken by bystanders. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the public scrutiny made it impossible for the department to sweep the case under the rug. For Tanner, the walls were closing in. He had always operated with impunity, confident that the system would protect him. But now his name was plastered across headlines, and his past actions were coming back to haunt him. Complaints that had been dismissed or buried were being re-examined, painting a damning picture of a man who had abused his power for years. Inside his home, Tanner's life unraveled. Protesters gathered outside, their chants echoing through the neighborhood. His neighbors avoided him, and even his fellow officers distanced themselves. He became a pariah, the embodiment of everything wrong with the justice system. Karen, on the other hand, found herself thrust into the spotlight. Invitations for interviews poured in, and her story reached a global audience. But Karen was careful not to let the attention consume her. With Jake's guidance, she used the platform to advocate for systemic change, calling for better training, accountability, and oversight in law enforcement. "I'm not here to vilify every officer," she said during a panel discussion. "I'm here to demand that the badge be a symbol of integrity, not a shield for misconduct." Her words struck a chord, sparking conversations and debates across the country. Jake, ever the strategist, helped her navigate the complexities of activism. He arranged meetings with lawmakers, introduced her to influential figures, and ensured her voice was heard. But not all battles were fought in public. Behind closed doors, Jake was relentless in holding the police department accountable. He pushed for Tanner's dismissal, a public apology, and reparations for Karen. The department, under intense pressure, began to crack. One evening, as Karen and Jake sat in her living room, the news aired a report on the investigation. The anchor announced that Tanner had been officially suspended and was facing criminal charges for misconduct and animal cruelty. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She turned to Jake, her eyes wide. "It's happening," she whispered. Jake smiled, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his usual stoicism. "It's just the beginning." But Karen knew the journey wasn't over. While Tanner's downfall was a victory, it was only one step toward a larger goal. The system that had allowed him to operate unchecked still needed to be addressed, and Karen, with Jake by her side, was determined to keep fighting. As the night wore on, Karen sat by the window, Max curled up in her lap. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world she was trying to change. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was a movement, a call to action. And Karen was ready to lead the charge. Building the movement. Karen stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, a blur of meetings, interviews, and rallies. Her story had become a symbol of resilience, but with it came the weight of expectation. Today, she was preparing for her most significant appearance yet, a public forum on police accountability. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was Jake. "You ready?" he asked, his voice steady as ever. Karen took a deep breath. "I think so. It's just a lot." "You'll do fine," Jake assured her. "Just remember why you're doing this. Speak from the heart." Karen smiled, grateful for his support. "I will." The forum was held at a local community center, its modest exterior belying the significance of the event. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Rows of chairs were filled with people from all walks of life: activists, community leaders, families, and media representatives. A stage was set up at the front, flanked by banners bearing the words "Justice and Reform Now." Karen arrived to a wave of applause. She was greeted by Alan, who had been instrumental in organizing the event. His calm demeanor helped steady her nerves. "You're the keynote speaker," Alan said with a reassuring smile. "Just tell your story. That's why they're here." Karen nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. She took her seat at the head of the stage, flanked by a panel of experts, including Jake. As the moderator introduced the event, Karen scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces, neighbors, colleagues, even a few strangers who had reached out to her with words of encouragement. Their presence gave her strength. When her turn came, Karen rose to her feet. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath, her prosthetic leg clicking softly against the floor as she approached the podium. "My name is Karen Washington," she began, her voice steady. "A few weeks ago, my life changed forever." She recounted the incident in the park, the officer's cruelty, the public humiliation, the loss of her beloved rabbit Max. Her voice trembled at times, but she pressed on, her words resonating with the crowd. "But this isn't just about me," she continued. "This is about a system that allows people like him to act with impunity. It's about the countless others who have faced similar abuse and been silenced. We can't let this continue." The audience erupted into applause, their energy fueling Karen's resolve. "I'm here today," she said, "not just to seek justice for myself, but to demand change for everyone. This isn't just my fight. It's ours." From story to movement, Karen's speech became the rallying cry for a burgeoning movement. What began as a single story of injustice grew into a nationwide call for reform. Social media campaigns gained momentum, with hashtags like #KarenSpeaks and #SystemicChangeNow trending for weeks. Grassroots organizations reached out, offering their platforms to amplify Karen's voice. Jake, ever the strategist, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He connected Karen with lawmakers, civil rights groups, and influencers who could push the movement forward. He also used his government position to advocate for policy changes, proposing legislation that emphasized police accountability and transparency. Karen, He said one evening over dinner, "This is bigger than us now. It's becoming a blueprint for change." Karen nodded, though the weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on her. "I just want to make sure it doesn't lose sight of the people it's meant to help." Jake smiled, his admiration for his sister evident. "That's why you're the perfect person to lead it." Confronting the past. As Karen's movement gained traction, more people began coming forward with their own stories of abuse at the hands of Sergeant Brad Tanner. A mother shared how Tanner had falsely accused her teenage son of theft, intimidating him into a confession. A small business owner recounted how Tanner had harassed him for months after refusing to offer him free goods. Each story painted a clearer picture of a man who had wielded his badge as a weapon. Karen met with many of these individuals, their shared experiences forging a bond of solidarity. Together, they formed a coalition called Voices for Justice, dedicated to holding law enforcement accountable and supporting victims of police misconduct. One day, Karen received an unexpected call from an elderly woman named Mrs. Hathaway. Her voice was frail but resolute. "I need to meet you," Mrs. Hathaway said. "There's something you should know about Tanner." Karen agreed, and the next day she visited the woman's modest home. Mrs. Hathaway greeted her with a warm smile, her hands shaking slightly as she led Karen to the living room. "I knew Tanner when he was a boy," Mrs. Hathaway began, settling into an armchair. "He was always trouble. But it's not just him. His father was the same way, a man who thought rules didn't apply to him." Mrs. Hathaway shared stories of Tanner's upbringing, painting a picture of a toxic environment that had shaped him into the man he was. Karen listened intently, her anger tempered by a deeper understanding of the cycle of abuse and entitlement that had perpetuated Tanner's behavior. "Thank you for telling me this," Karen said, her voice filled with gratitude. "It helps to know where he came from, even if it doesn't excuse what he's done." Mrs. Hathaway nodded. "You're doing something important, Karen. Don't stop." The tipping point. As the movement gained national attention, the police department faced mounting pressure. Public protests grew larger, with demonstrators demanding systemic reform. Media outlets continued to expose corruption and misconduct within the department, and the mayor was forced to address the issue publicly. "We hear you," the mayor said during a press conference, "and we are committed to making changes to ensure this never happens again." The internal investigation into Tanner concluded with damning results. He was formally charged with misconduct, abuse of power, and animal cruelty. The department announced a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training, body camera policies, and the creation of an independent oversight committee. For Karen, it was a moment of bittersweet triumph. Tanner's downfall was a step forward, but she knew the fight was far from over. Karen's vision. One evening, as Karen sat with Jake and Alan in her living room, she shared her next steps. "I want to create something lasting," she said, "a foundation that supports victims, educates communities, and pushes for reform." Jake nodded, his eyes gleaming with pride. "You have the momentum. Let's make it happen." Together, they began planning the Hope Rising Foundation, an organization dedicated to turning Karen's pain into progress. They envisioned legal aid programs, community workshops, and advocacy campaigns that would ensure stories like Karen's weren't just moments of outrage, but catalysts for lasting change. As Karen lay in bed that night, Max curled up beside her. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The road ahead was long, but she was no longer walking it alone. Her story, once a tale of pain and humiliation, had become a beacon of hope, and Karen was ready to lead the way. Hope in action. The morning sunlight streamed through Karen's bedroom window, painting the walls with a soft golden glow. Max stirred in his little bed, his whiskers twitching as Karen slipped out of her own. She had barely slept, her mind racing with plans for the day. Today wasn't just another step in her journey, it was a leap. Karen was scheduled to attend a town hall meeting organized by the Hope Rising Foundation, the nonprofit she had envisioned and now brought to life with Jake's help. It had been a monumental effort, but the foundation was now operational, with its first major initiative already underway, a community-driven program aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. "Max, wish me luck," she murmured, stroking his soft fur before grabbing her bag and heading out the door. The town hall. The auditorium was packed, the air charged with a mixture of anticipation and tension. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the seats, their faces reflecting a shared determination to confront the challenges that had plagued their community for years. Karen sat at the head table alongside Jake, Alan, and several community leaders. The event had drawn national attention, with reporters and camera crews positioned strategically throughout the room. At the back, a group of off-duty officers watched quietly, their expressions unreadable. The moderator stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "We are here today to discuss how we can rebuild trust, ensure accountability, and create a better future for all of us. Our keynote speaker needs no introduction. Karen Washington, whose courage has inspired a movement, will share her vision for change." The room erupted in applause as Karen stood. She gripped the edges of the podium, her prosthetic clicking softly against the floor as she steadied herself. Her gaze swept over the audience, taking in their expectant faces. "Good morning," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I stand before you today, not just as a survivor, but as someone who believes in the power of community. What happened to me was a moment, a painful, humiliating moment, but it sparked something bigger. It showed us what happens when people refuse to remain silent." Karen spoke about the Foundation's mission, its programs aimed at providing legal support for victims of misconduct, and its focus on fostering dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they served. She emphasized the importance of systemic reform, outlining policy changes that could prevent abuses like hers from happening again. "But this isn't just about policies or programs," Karen said, her voice rising with conviction. "This is about people, about all of us. Change starts with holding ourselves and each other accountable. It starts with listening, learning, and taking action." The audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation that filled Karen with a sense of accomplishment. But she knew the hardest part was yet to come. A tense confrontation. After the town hall, attendees mingled in the lobby, discussing the ideas and commitments shared during the event. Karen was speaking with a young activist when she noticed a group of officers approaching. At the front was Captain Mark Hansen, the head of the precinct where Sergeant Brad Tanner had worked. "Ms. Washington," Hansen said, extending a hand, "may we speak with you?" Karen hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Of course." The officers led her to a quieter corner of the lobby. Hansen's expression was serious but not hostile. "First, let me say that what happened to you was unacceptable. Tanner's actions don't reflect the values we're supposed to uphold." Karen's jaw tightened. "Supposed to?" Hansen sighed. "I won't defend what he did, but I will say that this has been a wake-up call for many of us. We know there's a problem, and we want to fix it." Karen crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Words are a start, Captain Hansen, but actions speak louder. What concrete steps are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Hansen nodded, as if expecting the question. "We're implementing mandatory bias training and increasing transparency in our disciplinary processes. But we need your help. Your foundation has a platform we don't. If we work together, we can make real progress." Karen studied him, weighing his sincerity. She had spent weeks fighting against the institution he represented, but she also knew that change required collaboration. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But understand this, I'm not here to make your job easier. I'm here to hold you accountable." Hansen nodded. "Fair enough." Reconciliation and resistance. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, planning sessions, and public appearances. Karen and Jake worked tirelessly to build momentum for the foundation, while Alan continued to handle the legal proceedings against Tanner. The former officer's trial was fast approaching, and the world was watching. Meanwhile, The foundation's programs began taking shape. Community workshops brought together residents and officers, fostering conversations that were often uncomfortable but necessary. Karen attended each one, sharing her story and listening to others. One evening, after a particularly heated session, Karen found herself sitting alone in the Foundation's office. She stared at a photo on her desk, one of Max taken before the incident. His absence still weighed heavily on her, a reminder of all she had lost. But it also fueled her determination. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Jake stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You okay?" he asked, setting one down in front of her. Karen nodded, just thinking about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. Jake leaned against the desk, his expression thoughtful. "You're doing something incredible, Karen, but don't forget to take care of yourself too." Karen smiled faintly. "I'm trying. It's just, there's so much at stake." Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And you're not carrying it alone. Remember that." The trial. The day of Tanner's trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Karen sat in the front row, flanked by Jake and Alan. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the sight of Tanner, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by visible unease, stirred a mix of emotions within her. The prosecution presented a compelling case, drawing on the video evidence and witness testimonies. Alan delivered a powerful closing argument, emphasizing the systemic issues Tanner's actions represented. "This case is about more than one man's misconduct," Alan said. "It's about sending a message that abuse of power will not be tolerated, that victims, no matter how vulnerable, will not be silenced." The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. Karen felt a surge of relief and vindication. Tanner's sentencing would follow, but for now, justice had been served. A new chapter. As Karen stepped outside the courthouse, she was met with a sea of supporters. They cheered and clapped, their energy buoying her spirits. Jake stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We did it," Karen corrected, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. But this is just the beginning. Karen knew the fight for justice and reform was far from over. But with the Hope-Rising Foundation gaining traction, a supportive community behind her, and her own unyielding determination, she was ready for whatever came next. Her story, once rooted in pain and humiliation, had become a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of change. And Karen was determined to keep writing it, one step at a time. The legacy of change. The evening air was crisp and cool as Karen Washington stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces gathered before her. The plaza was alive with energy, the crowd holding signs with words like "Hope Rising" and "Justice for All." Lights from camera crews dotted the edges of the space, capturing the moment for audiences across the world. Karen adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. This was the first anniversary of the incident that had changed her life. A day that had brought her to her knees, but had also sparked a fire she never thought possible. The event was the culmination of months of effort by the Hope-Rising Foundation, now a thriving organization with branches in multiple cities. What had started as a fight for her own dignity had evolved into a national movement for systemic reform. Karen's voice was steady as she began to speak. "1 year ago, I stood humiliated and broken in a public park. I was stripped of my dignity, my strength, and for a moment, my hope. But from that moment of darkness, a light emerged. Not just from me, but from all of you who stood up, spoke out, and said, 'No more.'" The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers reverberating through the night. Karen paused, letting the moment settle before continuing. "This isn't just my story. It's the story of every person who has ever been silenced, overlooked, or abused by a system that was supposed to protect them. It's a story of resilience, of unity, and of the power we have when we come together." Karen's world transformed. The months leading up to this moment had been transformative for Karen and the foundation. After Sergeant Tanner's conviction, the momentum for reform had only grown. Cities across the country began adopting policies inspired by Karen's advocacy. Independent oversight boards, mandatory body cameras, and de-escalation training became standard in many police departments. Karen had also been instrumental in pushing for the passage of the Community Accountability Act, a landmark piece of legislation that provided funding for community-led initiatives to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the public. Jake had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his influence to navigate the political landscape and ensure the bill's success. For Karen, the foundation's impact was deeply personal. She met countless individuals who shared their stories, some similar to her own, others vastly different, but no less important. She listened, learned, and drew strength from their courage. The foundation provided legal aid, mental health support, and advocacy training, turning victims into empowered agents of change. But Karen's work wasn't without its challenges. She faced criticism from skeptics who accused her of being too idealistic, from activists who thought her collaboration with law enforcement was a betrayal, and from those who sought to undermine her credibility. Yet, she remained resolute. "This isn't about sides," Karen would often say. "It's about building a system that works for everyone." A life rebuilt. In the quiet moments away from the public eye, Karen found herself reflecting on how far she had come. Her small apartment had been transformed into a warm, inviting space filled with books, plants, and photos of the people she had met through her journey. Max's memory lived on in the framed picture on her desk, a reminder of the gentle companion who had been her solace during her darkest times. Karen also reconnected with her family. Jake, once distant, had become her closest ally, their shared mission forging a bond stronger than ever. They often spent evenings together, brainstorming ideas for the foundation, or simply enjoying each other's company. "You've come a long way," Jake said one evening as they sat on her balcony, the city lights twinkling below. Karen smiled. "We both have." The new generation. One of the foundation's most ambitious projects was its youth mentorship program. Karen believed that change began with the next generation, and she was determined to empower young people to be leaders in their communities. One of her mentees was a teenager named Malik, whose older brother had been a victim of police brutality. Quiet and reserved at first, Malik slowly opened up under Karen's guidance. He shared his dreams of becoming a lawyer, inspired by her fight for justice. At the anniversary event, Malik stood beside Karen on stage, holding the microphone with a mix of nervousness and pride. "Ms. Washington taught me that no matter how young or small you feel, you can make a difference," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "She showed me that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way forward." Karen's heart swelled as the crowd cheered for Malik. Moments like this reminded her why she had taken on this fight. The future beckons. As the event drew to a close, Karen returned to the microphone for her final remarks. "This past year has been a journey of pain, growth, and transformation," she said. "We've achieved so much, but there's still work to be done. This isn't the end of the fight. It's just the beginning." She looked out at the crowd, her voice filled with emotion. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. It takes all of us, standing together, speaking out, and refusing to back down. So let's keep going. Let's keep fighting. Because together, we can create a world where justice and dignity are not privileges but rights." The applause was thunderous, a collective roar of determination and solidarity. Karen stepped back, letting the crowd's energy wash over her. A legacy of resilience. Later that night, Karen returned home, exhausted but fulfilled. She sat by her desk, looking at the photo of Max. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the humiliation, the pain, the loss, and how it had shaped her into the person she was now. She opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she poured her thoughts into words. It was the beginning of a memoir, a way to document her story and inspire others to find their own strength. As she wrote, Karen felt a deep sense of peace. She had turned her pain into purpose, her struggle into strength. And though the road ahead was still long, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. Her story had become a beacon, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, hope could rise. And with it, a brighter future for all. Closing the chapter, Karen stared at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking steadily as if urging her to keep going. The memoir wasn't just a collection of her experiences. It was her way of reclaiming her narrative. Every word she typed felt like a brick in the foundation of a legacy she was determined to leave behind. As she wrote, her phone buzzed beside her. It was Jake. "Karen, turn on the news," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Karen reached for the remote, switching the TV to the local news channel. The headline on the screen read, "Officer Brad Tanner sentenced to 15 years in prison for misconduct and cruelty." Karen's chest tightened as she listened to the anchor recount the case's details. Tanner had been found guilty on all charges, and his sentencing marked a significant victory for accountability in law enforcement. For Karen, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but the scars Tanner left behind would take much longer to heal. Jake called again moments later. "How do you feel?" he asked. Karen took a deep breath, her voice steady but reflective. "It's a step in the right direction, but it's not the end." "No," Jake agreed. "It's not. But it's a big win. A new beginning." The weeks following Tanner's sentencing were a whirlwind of activity. Karen's foundation, Hope-Rising, saw a surge in donations and volunteers. Chapters were being established in new cities, each one committed to empowering communities and advocating for reform. Karen, however, was beginning to realize she needed to take a step back. The fight had consumed her for so long that she had little time to process her own emotions. She discussed it with Jake during one of their late-night planning sessions. "I think I need to focus on my memoir for a while," she said. "The foundation is strong enough to keep going without me at the forefront." Jake nodded, his respect for her decision evident. "You've earned that, Karen. Take the time you need." Karen announced her decision publicly, assuring her supporters that she wasn't stepping away entirely, but was entrusting the foundation to a capable team. Her speech was met with understanding and encouragement. Closure. One afternoon, Karen visited the park where the incident had occurred. It was the first time she had returned since that fateful day. The air was crisp, the laughter of children filling the space as families enjoyed the open field. Karen walked to the bench where she used to sit with Max. She carried a small bouquet of white lilies, which she gently placed on the grass beneath the bench. For a moment, she stood in silence, her eyes closed as she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a group of young people nearby, holding a community meeting organized by one of Hope-Rising's local chapters. She smiled, the sight filling her with a sense of purpose. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an email from her publisher. "Karen, the first draft of your memoir is incredible. We're excited to bring your story to the world." Karen closed the email, her heart swelling with both pride and gratitude. She had turned her pain into progress, her humiliation into hope. And now, her story would inspire countless others to do the same. A legacy of hope. Months later, Karen's memoir, Hope-Rising, My Journey from Pain to Purpose, was released to critical acclaim. It became a bestseller, sparking discussions and debates across the country. Readers connected deeply with Karen's vulnerability, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to change. The Hope-Rising Foundation continued to grow, its influence reaching far beyond what Karen had imagined. Its programs became models for community-driven reform, and Karen's vision of a world where justice and dignity prevailed was slowly becoming a reality. Karen herself found a new rhythm to her life. She balanced her work with moments of peace, writing, reconnecting with old friends, and traveling to speak at events that aligned with her mission. She had found a way to fight for change while also honoring her need for rest and reflection. The final word. One evening, Karen stood on a stage at a prestigious award ceremony. She had been invited to accept a humanitarian award for her work with the foundation. As she approached the podium, she felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. "This award isn't just for me," Karen said, her voice steady. "It's for everyone who stood up when it was easier to stay silent. It's for every person who turned their pain into power, their fear into courage. And it's a reminder that the fight for justice is never over." The audience rose to their feet, the applause echoing through the hall. Karen stepped back, her heart full. As she exited the stage, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had come so far from that day in the park, transforming her pain into a movement that would outlast her. And though the fight was far from over, Karen knew she had made her mark on the world. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in a better tomorrow. And in that, she found her greatest victory.